the replaying of the present is helpful, and you can go deeper when you go upstream, which is what we're doing here. So there's a way you could map this, which is if we're mapping this in a stream, down at the, we'll call present level is emotions. And then upstream from there is meaning. Upstream from there is stories. Upstream from stories are words. And upstream from words are experiences. Once you understand how these things are stacked or how they build upon each other, you have the ability to do this excavation work, which is really beautiful and helpful and fun. People are going to forget how to like look at another person, like when they talk.
Yeah, because you're saying we're so used to seeing ourselves.
Yeah. It's like this perpetual third person experience.
Yeah.
Of life.
Yeah, there's also something almost metaphorical in there too. Kind of, you know, today there's such a criticism of like social media.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things is it's just like when we're like that self-aware, right? It's like holding up a mirror to yourself all the time. It's like looking in the mirror all the time. And I don't think anyone really thrives in that way. And I find for myself, you almost become more, by definition, like self-conscious, right? Because you're just paying attention to yourself rather than paying attention to the value you're offering or paying attention to how you're helping people or what the experience is of the person on the other side. I went ahead and just hit record because I don't even know where we like are going to start. I'm like really excited.
I was hoping that you'd do that. I was like, it'd be kind of fun to switch it up and just be like from the get-go, like this is a non-scripted, fun conversation.
Yeah, well, that's interesting because what you were even saying earlier about having kind of maybe more informal conversations or having to like a beer while we were on an episode talking to somebody, right?
Yeah.
It's funny because I actually feel like part of my journey now already, because my recording with you is the first one that I did, right, for Potent. So I noticed even during that first recording, it's like you go into something for the first time, and I think it's easy to go and you kind of are trying to almost like do what people expect you to do.
Right.
I've noticed this is a pattern for me where like when I first started doing speaking in like small ways and then larger ways, and this, it's like you're always trying to model after other people.
Yeah.
And there's also a sense that because so much of the noise that's available online is really just like noise. It's very tightly edited and it's very kind of almost packaged in a certain way to make it feel, I don't know, most accessible to like very short attention spans.
Right.
But what I'm coming to a belief of is actually the things that are most worthy. They do have a certain level of like depth and they have a certain level of like authenticity to it. Right. So I actually love the idea of just being more informal because then it's like, okay, something's actually happening here. And it's not just like, okay, well, now here's this next little checkbox for us to go and cover.
Yeah. I remember it was like 5 years ago, I read this quote and I'll paraphrase it. I don't remember it, but it was something like, once you start putting yourself out there, something like that, you have this danger of imitating others. And then if you're not careful, you'll go even further and you'll start imitating yourself. And I was just like, oh, like, you know, sometimes you like read a thing and you're like, I get it. Like I both get it and I'm getting it. Mm-hmm. You know, it kind of relates also to like the self-view on or off during a Zoom call. It's like, well, it's like this kind of like paradox because in one sense, it's like you can't create good art if you're not self-aware. And if you're quote unquote too self-aware, then you also can't create good art. Mm-hmm. And it's this weird balance, but yeah, I know what you mean in terms of like wanting something so bad or caring about something so much that you like lose your touch or your authenticity. Like I worked with a speaking coach and I remember like the first like big talk I gave after working with this person, I just overthought the whole thing. Like everything was way too formulaic and I was thinking about like the mechanics of storytelling. And my mother-in-law listened to this podcast and she was like, that wasn't you. Like that wasn't you. And I was like, oh, she's right. And that's interesting.
What would you say was different?
I was thinking too much. It was too conscious in a sense. Well, it was both that and so I always think about like the spectrum of like there's formlessness, there's formula, and then there's form. And for this talk, I was over in the formula. I was like holding on too tightly to these principles of storytelling. And so then I lost the naturalness, which is in form. Form still has that order and structure, but it's not locked in. So I felt like I was in the formula kind of space. And then like, maybe this is the same thing, but like, yeah, overly conscious.
Would you say that's almost like if you think of an actor can have the script down so precisely and maybe think through all the movements, and you could on one level say technically that they do an excellent job hitting all the cues and all the marks. But in some ways, if it's too rigid in that way, or if that's their emphasis, that then they're actually not focusing on scene and they're actually not present. They're actually like their own self isn't necessarily shining through, and that's why it feels kind of dead. And that's what I'm hearing when you explain that is like there's a way to mechanically approach something perfectly, but if the human element's not coming through, it feels lifeless because it's just mechanical. Yeah,
exactly. It's a sterile feeling, and it's worse to the extent that like the person is doing the thing really well. It makes that sterile effect worse. Because it's like the lack of selfhood of that person comes through. It's like it contrasts harder when it's too polished, you know?
So I'm a big believer that, okay, so I'm an entrepreneur. It's a little bit different for people who are maybe working for someone else or not in a particular workplace, staying at home, whatever that might be. But I think one of the ideas behind Potent is if your life is a gift and all the ways that you're designed, all the aspects of you, if there's like something really good, inherently good there, it becomes a question of how do you most fully give that to the world, right? And a lot of that has to do with like how you're specifically composed. And what I find, and this will actually probably be a really good segue into this idea of sense making, because for myself, I tend to have a desire to really understand my strengths and really understand like my specific composition. Because if I don't understand myself, then what I'm trying to do is replicate other people.
Yeah.
It's easier for me to see the strengths in another person and trying to replicate those strengths rather than my own. And so what I've tried to do is get feedback from people who do coaching with me, feedback from like key relationships I have, and have people mirror things back to me.
Yep.
And that's why part of it is like I've realized that I don't think this is for everyone, but when I'm at my best is when I'm doing this sort of thing and I'm really in the flow and I'm just engaging the person because I'm extremely curious. That's very real. You can't necessarily manufacture that. And so I'm trying to lean into that, right? Like me showing up most fully is not going to look exactly the same as someone else showing up most fully.
Yes. Yeah. That makes sense. And also before someone gets to that, there's this obstacle. It's typically unspoken, which is believing self as bad. So like, right, like there's all these words like being selfish or like that person's self-centered. It's like, well, okay, like I get what that means. I get what it means to be self-centered, but also like, what's the alternative? And is it bad to be centered in self? Right? So there's all these like unspoken, and it comes from a bunch of different angles. But yeah, I find that there's first, and you've already broken through it, but there's a crust of believing self to be bad and believing growth to be the exiting of self or the dying of self. So think of like self-denial or like self-control, where it's like and I know you, right? So I know that you understand the value of self-control. And in a very real sense, when I'm listening to you, what I hear is someone who is intentionally practicing how to control self less, not to become out of control, but to let self be rather than to control it. Does that?
Yeah. You are hitting on something I'm extremely passionate about. So it's really interesting. I sent out a email yesterday to the Monk Manual community because I'm going to be doing these value calls where basically I'm just going to hop on and I'm going to answer questions people have relative to the space the monk manual's in, right? So it's an opportunity for me to go and interface with people in the community.
Cool.
And I think show up again in like an area where I really can thrive, because it enables me to, in a sense, like show up in a more 3D way versus like a 2D way that might just be like a course or something. We've talked about this, the relational aspect.
Totally. Because that's going to be a live thing.
Yes, a live thing. Yeah.
Super cool.
And what's interesting is I asked actually in the registration, I asked, what is like the areas you're most looking to grow in, right? And I listed a bunch of things out. Like it was like habit formation, it's procrastination, it's productivity, it's mindfulness and spiritual growth, like all these different categories around that I think people come to the monk manual for, right? Because that also was going to be interesting to me. I wanted to see like, what is it that actually people are thinking, this is what I want, right?
Right.
And the number one thing right now that people have responded with is self-discipline. Now, this is what's really interesting to me is I think words really matter. And I sometimes come to find that my way of understanding a word is not necessarily how it's traditionally been understood.
Yes.
But the way that discipline often is applied, I actually think is really, really problematic. Because what I mean by that is oftentimes people, like, for example, someone will go maybe to the gym and like the beginning of the year, they'll say, hey, I want to go to the gym and I'm going to go and lose weight or whatever it might be. Then a few months later, they fall off the bandwagon, whatever it is, and they think like, oh, this is a discipline problem. But I tend to actually think that it's more of a desire problem. Like actual change happens when your desires change, when desires are reordered.
Yep.
Does that make sense what I'm saying?
It does.
And so if you're actually applying a model of like the way I'm going to grow is just by disciplining myself, it's like you're constantly trying to pull a horse in a direction it doesn't want to go. And eventually that horse is going to break free and it's going to say, I'm not going to this direction.
Totally.
Right? Because it's like you're actually, the change is almost done in a violent way. It's like a violence to self rather than trying to form this relationship to self and allowing self to come along for the ride, right? And those are two different experiences of life as well. Like people can get to a certain level of mastery, I think, through just like pushing it and pushing down and pushing in and pushing around. But it's also like, do you want to live your life pushing all the time?
Well, I mean, so there's a couple things in there. There's the word master in mastery, and there is violence. If you master self, then what does that make self? And you're both of these things in a sense, right? So like, you don't actually want a master. You want a friend. And then I think about that word violence is very close to volition. And part of what I hear when you describe that, like I translate it into my own kind of background and language, and there's a very old model of the soul, which describes the soul as having three powers. I think this is more a helpful framework. You can go too far with this and get too like buckety, you know, and yet it still helps you like remember the whole by accentuating the parts in a sense. But so it was an ancient medieval model, and it's saying that three powers of the soul are the intellect, the will, and the affections. So the will, in that situation, you are approaching going to the gym with a disintegrated soul. If you're only using one of its powers, which is willpower, right? And there's a bigger conversation of like why willpower is emphasized. I don't really have a good educational background in terms of historically why that's the case. I just know that it is the case. And what happens is we develop way too conscious and active view of oneself and also the mind. And then you get into this, like this can go really wrong and get like self-perpetual in the productivity space because there's all these other players in the conversation are left out and the thing gets isolated just around like, how can I control stuff better? Right? Whereas like, I pulled this little note out because I thought you'd find it fun. I really like this French writer. His last name is Sertiage. I think I mentioned this in our first interview. He wrote this little fun book called The Intellectual Life. And it's both what it sounds like and not what it sounds like. But like he has this quote. Well, first of all, he says passivity is the first law of the mind. Passivity, which most people like, they think the mind is like, I'm going to think through this thing, I'm going to stare at the thing, fix a puzzle or whatnot. But he emphasizes passivity of it. And actually, Hickman, did you ever read Traction?
I have, yeah.
He surprised me. He had a really great description of the mind where he's like, the mind works best like a parachute when it's open.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a really good description. But Sertiaj says this. He says, to try to project your thought into the object of knowledge, not keep it within yourself. I'll finish a quote and then I'll turn it into English. It says, you must look through the mind in the direction of things, not into the mind. Because the mind is the means of seeing, not the object of sight. So when we're thinking of like, what do we want to do? An easy mistake that we can make is have the planning of all that and the executing of all that be done up in here, like just in the conversation in the head, and then tweaking things from like, how can I make this easier to do or easier to think about? Whereas there's this whole element of like, you can change the direction of the wind that hits the sail rather than just like rowing more aggressively or getting like upgrading your oars, right? You can learn to channel the wind, and that comes into this element of like desire, right? Which is the channeling of one's desire is ultimately going to be the most powerful way to move. But a lot of people sabotage the desire. And the point I'm getting at is I agree with you that being in touch with one's desire and channeling that rather than just going straight to the willpower is the game. And you are only able to do that if you understand that your deepest desires are good and therefore worth making the space for. And a lot of people first get caught up of thinking that their deepest desires aren't good because it comes back to this conception of self as ultimately and fundamentally negative rather than positive.
It's interesting because what you're naming, okay, so if you're going to follow like that all upstream, it's like we're talking about there's these external manifestations, problems people might be running into. They have a bad habit they want to get over or struggle to, or a new habit they want to form.
Yeah.
It's like we see the external reality, and what you're saying is like, yeah, but it actually, if you want to go further upstream, like let's talk about like what are those actual desires, right? And how do you bring those into alignment? But even further than that, like if you're trying to really get to the root foundation thing, and maybe it's not the absolute root, but going even deeper is this idea that, okay, well, the reason those desires are actually out of alignment is because people don't believe that their desires are good on the most like fundamental desires. And maybe that's even tied to a feeling of like, well, deep down, like all the way, if I'm really honest, I'm not really all that sure I'm good, right? Now, what's interesting is that's all like very unconscious to virtually everyone, right? Like I think most people who are experiencing that do not know. Like even someone who's listening right now,
right?
You really actually have to sit and contemplate what was just said to be able to see it, and you still might not be able to see it immediately unless like you're in relationship with someone else who I think can help you navigate and see that. What's so interesting is, and I would say this is one of the things I'm really passionate about, but it's a problem to be solved in a sense, is like I'm trying to, in the productivity space, do like a bit of a judo move.
Right.
And redirect energy. So most of the productivity space, I would actually argue, comes out of like a place of fear, security, need for control. Like often the spirit of it is like, I need to master self. And that feels appropriate. Like, well, this is what a good like soldier does, or this is the right thing to do.
Yeah.
And like you were saying, it's like, what does that then make? It makes the self like a slave. But I think even one degree further is, I actually think that the master, usually because it's not coming from a person's desires, it's actually crowdsourced desires of others. So in a sense, like you're not even the master of the self. Like the master actually becomes the collective around you. And that's why it's like extremely, and it brings up a lot of malaise because people feel out of alignment where it's like, I'm actually maybe doing well in the ways that quote unquote, I think I should be.
Yes.
But because it's following all the desires of everyone else, it's like, it leaves like this giant hole in us, right? It makes us feel like a lack of vitality, a lack of, and we don't necessarily know what's going on. But the point there is, it's a really tricky thing because, like in a sense, whenever you're working with someone, and I'm sure you encounter this, like you're trying to, in a sense, a lot of times people do have this like inherently maybe like negative energy or fear-based, or they're maybe not aligned, and you're trying to redirect it, but you're having to fight against a lot of like subliminal forces operating within people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, and it's a lot, you are doing that. It's a lot easier to do that when they're operating outside the person rather than outside and inside the person rather than just inside. Because if it's inside, they literally can't see it.
Can you explain what you just said?
You're talking about subliminal influences within a person. And what I'm saying is the most helpful way to help someone see those influences is to literally help them see it. As in, move the location of that force from inside, behind their eyes, in their head, sometimes in their heart, to outside so that they can actually see the thing.
Yeah, well, my question around that, or what I'm wondering, just to make sure I'm aligned with you, is are you saying that it's about turning people to the concrete material of their lives? Like because we don't have access to...
Oh, okay.
It's like the inner world is so murky, or like our eyes don't necessarily turn all the way around, that everything's kind of a little bit amorphous within us. So it's like, let's look at the actual concrete, like let's look at what's actually playing out in your life, because that will reveal things back, because that's concrete. Or are you talking more about in like actual practices like journaling, things like that, where you're trying to kind of like a well, pull a bucket up of the stuff that's inside you and then put it out on the table to see what comes up?
Okay, that's cool, because I wasn't thinking about the former. I was thinking about the latter, which was more on the journaling side of things. Mm-hmm. Though there's a distinction within journaling and what I help you with. And yet you also do bring up a good point, which is you were saying you feel like you're doing a judo move in the productivity space.
Trying to.
And yeah, trying to.
I don't even know if it's going to land, but that's what I'm trying to do.
Right. But that makes that resonates with me, because I feel the same way, both in the productivity space and then also in two other spaces. One is like in the intellectual space, but then also in the mindset or emotional or like inner child space. Okay. Which is like, none of these spaces work if they just stay within themselves. Like the productivity space doesn't work if it just only looks at quote unquote productivity. Right? You help move the gaze outside of productivity by broadening what productivity is, right? But I see this too with like doing the quote unquote inner work. Is like anything that's loses touch with the other things becomes sick. So you can have someone who's like super high achiever, executive or multi-founder, blah, 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 blah. And then they can blow themselves up to bits. And then they can swing the pendulum in the other direction and go into like, you know, they've been burying all this stuff from earlier in their life, which they were trying to hide through the activity. They get in touch with some kind of executive coach, and then they go down this other direction of, you know, healing their inner child and doing mindset and breathing work and all that's good. And it ceases to be good if it loses contact with the other stuff, which they thought they had to totally let go of. So there is something really true to what you're saying, which is like, you do want to maintain contact with what's going on outside. And there's ultimately, like you and I talked about this, you know, within the first, like, I don't know, like 30 minutes of meeting each other, is like this doing versus being kind of thing, whereas we're both on the same page of it's ultimately doing and being, or doing as being and being as doing, rather than separating these things or opposing these things. And so I do see that as a, like, that makes sense with me too, is like sometimes I'll be working with somebody and I can help them do this inner stuff. And that inner stuff takes deeper root and flowers if it's reconnected and reintegrated into the, you know, external activity and doesn't just stay all internal. But yes, then there's this other element of what I meant, which was more the direction of taking what's inside and helping it come outside, not through activity, but more through making sense of what is that emotion that I feel, or what are the thoughts that I had during the day, and going in that direction.
Okay, I want to pick up on that around this concept of sense making, because I think one thing that's kind of not maybe haunted me. Yeah, I use that language, so let's just stick with it. Since the conversation we had, it's so funny because I feel like when you interact with people who are masters in a particular domain, sometimes the way they approach things is they figure out a way to like really, really simplify things to a point where it's kind of like taking a piece of pizza or something you put in a blender. So it's like you don't even have to chew it, right? And sometimes that's the case. But sometimes it's almost like you have to let things linger and unpack and mull over things to really get a sense of it. And I think that there were certain things that we talked about where at the time I was like, I thought I even understood it. And then after the fact, I was like, I don't know if I fully understand exactly that, but there seems to be something there because I think the nature of it is like a lot of your work is rooted in different philosophical underpinnings. And philosophy is always, at least my experience is whenever I encounter a philosophy or something that challenges a worldview, I mean, it actually feels like my mind has to like physically pack up and move to another location. Like it's not simple. Like it's not additive where you're just like adding another decimal onto something. It's like all of a sudden the whole thing is changing, or it's turning from like a color to a number. Like it's that fundamental of a shift.
Yep.
And in this idea of sense making is really, really, really interesting for me because I would say, and I don't know if this is unique to me, I really don't know. I'd be really interested to hear. You can kind of like be the clinician for me right now.
Yeah, totally.
So I've for a lot of my life felt maybe like my brain works a little bit different from other people. Obviously, I don't have access to know that, but I just noticed that maybe the way I communicate or the way I think, I tend to be very visual in the way I think. I also tend to, I think, be like highly efficient at divergent thought. What I mean by that is seeing connections between things, like everything's matrixed together, and I can see how this connects to that and this and that, and because of that, I can sometimes see landscapes and how things are connected in ways others might not. Now, the difficulty is I've traditionally found it difficult for me to synthesize. What I mean by that is it's like I'm fairly good at the divergent, and I'm competent on some level in the convergent, but it's always a more difficult process for me to go and take all the material and then actually separate the noise from the signal or the signal from the noise. Does that make sense? So
yeah, I'm following you.
So the idea, like one of the things that was kind of this, like I was saying, haunted me is this idea of like making sense. I feel like a lot of times what feels like the barrier for me is like things make sense, but in abstraction. What I mean by that is like, it's like my own mind, it's like a world of forms or something. And it makes sense to me. It's like a director who wants to get a shot and they can see the shot, but they can't necessarily translate what they're seeing, right? Like it's difficult for them to go and express that or communicate that.
Okay.
And I think part of that is a process of making sense. And maybe I'm wrong, but I think part of that, and what I was attracted to as I was thinking about this, is like being able to take all that is within me, and I think hopefully will be helpful for like the audience, is I think most people, if they're struggling with anything, it does feel like a rock grinder or something that's kind of tumbling things over and over and over inside them, right? Like not necessarily rumination, that might be too strong.
Yeah, okay.
But there's a lack of clarity, right? As I understand what you were describing as sense making, it's like, how do you come to clarity in one specific way or maybe many different ways? So I'd love to hear, when you hear what I'm describing, which I would even argue feels like right now at this phase of my life, like the central thing that I want to improve. Like it has to do with communication. It has to do with this ability to, maybe it is make sense. I don't know. I'd love to just hear your thoughts on what I just said, because rather than throwing out more and more stuff, I think that's enough to work with.
Yeah, totally. So there's first a question of like, how do you put into words what you're haunted about? I'll offer a fill in the blank and then you fill in the blank.
Okay.
Part of me feels haunted that, and then fill in the blank.
What's coming to mind is that I can't make sense of what I'm thinking.
Okay. and that's scary because.
All right. This is a great prompt. So that's scary because if I'm not able to have clear thinking, I don't feel I can inhabit all of my roles well, right? So it impacts my ability to fulfill the mission I want to with Monk Manual. It impacts my ability to gain clarity on matters of personal growth. It makes it difficult for me to separate signal from the noise.
Mm-hmm. And when you imagine that happening, not being able to inhabit those roles, what feelings accompany that image in the mind? Is it disappointment? Is it fear of missing out on something? What are the primary emotions?
Okay. The surface of it is feeling out of control. The emotion that is generated when I connect with feeling out of control is, okay, it's fear. I mean, fear is like the shortest answer.
Yeah.
It's fear. What is it fear of? It's fear of being out of control, but it's okay, what would happen if I was out of control? It's fear around, like really basically, if I can't serve as well as I want to, then that means that the monk manual doesn't actually help people the way it can. And potent and everything I do, coaching. And if that's the case, I don't know the emotion. It has something to do with isolation though.
Yeah. Okay, good. Cool. Take one step back. So there we were in why there's the fear. Let's take the why out and come back into the fear. What's the texture of the fear? Where in your body, when you have that a lot, when you feel it, how do you feel it? Where in your body do you feel the fear?
Okay, I'm going to answer that, but I think just one thing to color it. My normal experience, it's almost like being, I imagine like a professor or something at like a whiteboard trying to solve a really, really difficult problem.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like feels very, very important to them because it feels like something's going to click. And I would even say that part of like the urgency I think I feel is people ask me like how the monk manual started, and I'll explain that there's this. It's like actually very, very hard for me to explain. It's almost like a Venn diagram with 100 circles overlapping each other of all these different experiences and things I've read. It's like everything, right? Like I feel like I'm like in a place of discovery actually, of like mapping something out that I'm not sure has been mapped down the exact same way. And that's extremely exciting and extremely personal to me. And it's almost like I just want to get the puzzle pieces arranged the right way.
Okay.
Because it's like if I can just unlock it fully, it's like that's when the plug goes into the outlet and the whole thing gets supercharged. With that said, where do I feel it? I feel it predominantly, I would actually say like in my like gut area, and it's like gravelly.
Nice. Okay, very cool. And when you feel the gravel, 1 is low, 10 is high. What's the ballpark intensity of the gravel feeling?
I want to say it's a 3 or a 4.
Cool. Yeah, we're going with the gut kind of the number here. Now, before we go further on that, is this fear or is this excitement?
We could probably spend the next 2 hours on that.
For the listener, we did book 3 hours.
I think that it's, okay, I'm going to start by just saying this and maybe you can challenge me here.
Mm-hmm, exactly.
It feels like both, or I think it's both. And this is what I mean. It's like, I feel like it's both. I also feel like there's something deeper. So are you familiar with Joseph Campbell's like hero's journey and all of that?
I loosely,
okay.
but no, I don't think so.
Yeah, so there's something that came out more recently, like it was fairly popular over the past 10 years, and there's different models for it, but one's called Storybrand, and it talks about like breaking things down into like, okay, well, a hero's trying to solve a problem. There's actually 3 levels. Like one level is, and it's funny, it's been a while since I've dove into it, so actually I won't remember all of them off the top of my head, but it's like kind of like, what's the external battle they're fighting? And then what is like what's the philosophical thing underpinning that? And then what's actually like the almost like moral or personal. So for me, there's actually like one level of it is just excitement because it's like, it feels so intimately tied to my own personal journey. What I mean by that is I feel 100% like I'm doing what I'm like made to be doing. Right. Like I feel 100% like I'm in the pocket.
Mm-hmm.
Like this is what I was composed, like because there's just so much that's interconnected that it feels like this is really me.
Got it.
Riding like the horse that's uniquely mine or something. Right. It's like my thing, at least like right now. I'm not saying like even the monk manual is my thing, but like the path I'm on, it feels very connected for me.
Yeah.
There's also a feeling of, so there's excitement on that level. There's also excitement, but also even fear. So I'm a relatively deep feeler. And what I mean by that is like, I even have a hard time watching the news sometimes because it's like, oh, here's this like
Mhm.
town that got bombed and here's these kids. And like, I can't relate to that as just numbers. Like it
Yeah.
like hits my heart. Right. And
Yeah.
I think in the, like my response, I don't know if it's a defense mechanism. It's probably healthier than a lot of other options, but my response to like the darkness and suffering in the world is to in some ways, like personally try and redirect that energy to something creative, which is what I see the work I do doing. So it's like, I also feel like it's not quite the same urgency of people like say working on something that's going to like end a war or something that's going to like cure a particular disease. But there does feel like an urgency to it, like an urgency to, because I really believe this, like I really, really believe this. The thing we were talking about before when we were talking about people operating maybe from a place of disparity or acting as like slaves to a master that's not even themselves, whatever it is.
Yep.
Like that's real. That's like real people. Those are real lives. Like there's real problems. There's trickle down effects. It impacts families. Like it's serious to me, right? Like, and it feels like, okay, this is a place where I can personally do some good. And there's an urgency that feels like that comes from that because I really want to help people. At the same time, I would imagine that there's also deeper things, right? So if that's like the philosophical battle and if that's the external thing, there's probably also some deeper thing of, okay, like, well, what does my life actually mean?
So the excitement, does it feel like the excitement is from the outside coming into you, or does it feel like the excitement is in you going out? Based off of you describing the in the pocket thing, I want to first say what I think I'm hearing, and then you correct me, which is the excitement feels more like it's on the inside and it's coming outward. Is that right?
It is 100% coming from the inside out. And it's a very strong energy.
Yep. Yeah, good. Okay, so I'm with you. And then the other thing is you said there's a redirection of energy. It's like we could say, using words broadly, an experience of dark energy, which could be like that what you feel when you see bombs going off or people getting hurt, right? And then it's a redirection of that. Is that correct?
Yeah, I do think that's correct. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Can you try to describe that energy then? Or do we have it? Are we moving in the right direction in the sense of describing it as initially dark?
So I think on one hand, I would maybe say yes, but I also think it depends on what we mean is like the connotation behind dark.
Is heavy more accurate than dark?
That's a good question. Is it heavy? It is heavy. Yeah, it's heavy.
You're in touch with it, so I'm actually going to jump forward a little bit, which is, can you tell me the top moments when you felt that kind of energy? And by that, I mean specific moments in your life. And you don't need to tell me the details. We're just going to title these moments.
Okay. I think my 12th birthday, maybe. My birthday's September 11th. And I think it was my 12th birthday that September 11th happened. And that was a thing for me.
Mm-hmm. Do you remember a specific moment on that day?
I remember multiple moments. I remember being in the computer lab when they announced that one of the towers had been hit. I also remember being in my kitchen with my like family singing happy birthday to me. And I was actually like crying.
Mm-hmm.
And it was because it represented
Yep.
something larger too. It was kind of like my path from like kind of this childhood innocence thing to something like it was, there was a lot going on there. And interesting, like it's
Totally.
not directly the same, but I remember the season after that in the library of my school, they would like have on during the day, like bombings taking place. Like they would just be showing on a TV night raids where they're just blowing things up, which to this day, I'm like, I don't know why they're showing like kids that, but maybe, I don't know.
That was on a different day, correct?
It was a different day, but it feels connected is what I'm saying.
Good. Okay, cool. We'll give that a name of watching bombings in the library.
Yeah.
Yeah? Good.
Okay, another thing would be, okay, I had a brief stint of living in New York City, and I actually moved there before ever having been there. And I remember the first time I even got on the subway, it was a little bit of like a culture shock because like in a city like that, they don't whitewash everything and hide like suffering. Like you do see and have to encounter poverty, and you do have to see and encounter people in very like bad situations. And I remember getting on the subway the first time And I'm sitting across from this guy in a military jacket, and like the look in his eyes, like he was on something. And I remember like that really cut me in a certain sense. But there are a lot of different experiences like that.
Mm-hmm. Can you title that experience?
Yeah. Maybe just like common suffering. I don't know if that's a helpful title, but that's what it was. Like I remember. Yeah. Okay.
Title being helpful for this exercise is going to mean it brings you to a specific moment and it moves you from a theme to an instance that you'll remember once you look at that title. So it could be like seeing the man in the metro, or
let's call it homelessness in New York City.
Cool.
And I mean that both literally and metaphorically.
Yeah, but it represents that moment of looking at this man, correct?
Yeah. That'll be connected for me.
Okay, cool. I'll do a little bit, very light bit, explaining what we're doing as we're doing it. I'm going to ensure that I don't bottleneck the experience, but there's opportunities to teach along the way. So part of what we're doing is like, so Stephen is telling me that the current of his thinking tends to be outwards. And so part of the benefit of titling specific moments is these moments have a beginning and they have an end. Not artificially. It's like they actually had a beginning and an end. When we can find the location of a strong emotion or a strong energy, and then it's inside a thing, we have a lot better chance of making sense of that thing rather than if it's like put in a essential oil diffuser and like, is everywhere, right? So that's just a little bit of why we're doing it this way. Okay, cool. Can I ask you a couple other questions?
You may.
We're in touch with this urgency, like the heavy energy that's going to get redirected, right? And we've got a couple titles here. Look backwards at that gravelly feeling in the gut. You were describing it as first it was fear, then you were locating it in the gut, and the texture was of gravel, and it was on an intensity of 3 when I asked you the question. So my first question is, when did you first feel that gravelly feeling in your life?
This hasn't come through like computational reason, but
we don't want that.
This is what emerged and it feels connected. So I'm just going to name it. Yeah, I'm just going to name it. 2 things came up. One was, there's one instance where I remember I was at like a doctor's office and something ended up happening. I won't share like all the details, but I actually ended up, because of someone being distracted, I actually ended up being like left behind in a parking lot. It was only for like 5 minutes, but I was a kid, right? So I'm just like there in this parking lot.
Title that moment.
Let's just call it parking lot.
Okay, cool.
And then there's another instance where I had a family member, not my direct family, but a family member who had a very hard life and struggled the majority of their life with pretty intense addiction.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember as a kid, this person coming to the door of my house,
mm-hmm.
and I didn't know the person was coming. So I'm like a little kid. I open the door and I see this person who, like in a sense, kind of had like the scent of death, right? Like in a you know what I'm saying? Like like you can kind of see the like corrosion taking place. And I remember this individual asking to come in, and I like freaked out and I locked the door like for the screen, and then they were trying to like open it up to like come in.
Mm-hmm. Good. Title that moment.
We are going deep. This is so good.
Mm-hmm.
Let's call it front door.
Okay. So there's a couple things here. One is Stephen said, this is not my like computational, rational, it's not coming from there. It couldn't come from there. When we're going to use Stephen's language, like subconscious stuff, we want to be in contact with the closest eyewitnesses. Okay. Now I'm making an educated guess. You were fairly young with both of those stories. The front door, is that what you just called it? Front door and parking lot?
Yeah.
Okay. So how old were you roughly?
It's possible that the parking lot one was as early as 4, but I want to say that was closer to 6. I want to say the other one was closer to 6, like maybe 6, 7.
Okay.
Maybe 8.
I was going to guess 5 to 6 for that first one. I didn't know about that the front door one. Okay. And this is typical. And here's the thing. When you look at what the progression of what is available developmentally wise, when you're back in those moments, your computational analytical thinking wasn't the closest eyewitness. Okay, your emotions were, and movements of the gut were. So when we're going backwards to make sense of these things, a common mistake is to think we need to first like go through this screen door of our abstract rational thinking, which is actually going to get in the way, not because it's bad, it just wasn't there fully. It wasn't closest to the scene. Does this make sense?
It makes sense, yeah.
Cool. Can you tell me, what does it feel like when you're in the pocket?
I feel excited. There's almost like a radiance and like a fullness that feels like it's kind of like welling up. There is a
From
sense of flow. Where's it coming from? Physically, it feels like it's coming from my heart space. It actually feels like, like the feeling of connection you can have with another individual. It feels like that with myself.
Good. Okay, cool. So when are some moments, highlight Hall of Famer moments when you have felt that? And we want specific experiences or memories. And you're going to title them, not tell me them.
Do you want me to give you any of the details or just give you a title?
Titles for now.
Final prompts.
Mm-hmm.
Connecting core principles.
Mm-hmm. That's a specific moment.
Yeah, but it's a moment that's happened multiple times because it's kind of a nature of my work.
Yeah. Title it around one of these times.
Let's call it Mapping Disney World.
Okay. Did you have another title that was falling out of the welling up from the heart?
Yeah, I don't know if this is a title per se, but I'd like to just name this. I actually feel like it right now.
Yeah.
So, like in all those instances, if I'm going to plug something into like an internal GPS to like find the locations of these things, it's like all based around times where I felt courageous because I'm letting something happen that feels really true for me. And there's even like a certain level of like nakedness to it. Like nakedness to a degree that it's like, it feels bold maybe. It's coming from like a deep place, right? It's like, it's not shrouded. Like, I don't feel like I'm shrouding anything right now.
Mm-hmm. Right. Because you're not.
Yeah.
Cool. So we'll call this, I don't know, Naked Call with Andy.
Great. I'll have to put that on my calendar. My assistant can see what I did on Friday morning.
Okay, so we're going to go on a 3-part adventure, and it'll follow probably that hero's journey. Emotions exist in layers. So like one common one is that anger sits on top of sadness. When someone's really angry, they are really angry, and under that is a deep, deep sadness. You usually can't get access to that sadness until you get through the anger. Okay. So we're going to go through this in a particular order because these emotions are hanging out in a particular order. So first, we're going to make sense of the gravel. Then we're going to make sense of the urgency. And then we're going to make sense of the welling up. So we'll take one story from each of these places, and then I'll lead you through the same kind of exercise I do with the people I work with. So parking lot or front door, which of these has more of the gravel feeling in the gut? Another way to ask that question, which do you feel less like doing? Like, which do you have like, a stronger of a feeling towards?
Yeah. What do I want to avoid more?
Yeah.
Yeah, I would actually say it's probably the parking lot.
Okay, cool. Great. And then which of these stories feels like today, because it can change day to day, has the most of the feeling of the heavy energy and then the desire, that urgency to redirect it. Crying while happy birthday's being sung, watching bombs in library, or homelessness in New York City.
The highest energy is around the September 11th thing. Like that experience.
Yeah, that makes sense.
It's like bubbles. It's like when you have seltzer, like water, and there's like a lot of bubbles in it. It's like the pressurized can.
Yep. Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, and then which would you like to do for the radiance, fullness, welling up from heart? Final prompts or mapping Disney World?
The mapping Disney World.
Okay, cool. So, okay, I have a couple questions. One is, have you ever titled these experiences before?
No.
Okay, have you thought about these experiences before?
Yes.
Okay, have you journaled about these experiences before?
The welling up ones, yes. Not the others. I've talked about them, but I haven't like written about them.
Cool. Okay, this gives me context that also, I mean, the conversation of, now that you see them, do they fit under the umbrella of journaling? Like, are they a kind of topic that you would normally journal about?
No, not really. Most of my journaling practice is more present state.
Right.
In terms of writing about what's happening in real time. I have not done a ton of like excavation work.
Good. Okay, cool. Sweet. So it's good to journal. And journaling can mean like so many different things to different people. What tends to be the case is two things. One is you are replaying the present, kind of like you're describing. The other thing is you tend to re-experience it rather than observe it. And the observing comes from an understanding of words, which I will withhold for now because I don't want to bias how you go about this exercise, but we can get into it later or whatever. The other point here is the replaying of the present is helpful, and it's a heck of a lot helpful than never doing any reflecting. And you can go deeper when you go upstream, which is what we're doing here. So there's a way you could map this, which is if we're mapping this in a stream, down at the, we'll call present level is emotions. And then upstream from there is meaning. Upstream from there is stories. Upstream from stories are words. And upstream from words are experiences. Once you understand how these things are stacked or how they build upon each other, you have the ability to do this excavation work, which is really beautiful and helpful and fun. Okay, so Stephen, I want to share a Word document with you. And what you're going to do is write out the stories that we've titled here. And you're going to see the titles of those stories: Parking Lot, Crying During September 11th Birthday, and Mapping Disney World. Cool. Here are the prompts for writing stories. And for the listener, these are the same prompts you would want to do when you do this, which is you want to write in complete sentences. You want to make it a three-dimensional experience. So the devil is in the details. So you want to get detailed in the story. What were you feeling? What, and again, bring the senses in. Do you remember what did you hear? Complete sentences and get into the juicy details because the devil's in the details. Okay, cool. Stephen, go for it. If it takes you 10 minutes to write these 3 stories, awesome. If it takes you 15 minutes, cool. If it takes you 20 minutes, great. Do the writing well. Everything else flows out from there.
Okay, so I'm doing this right now?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay. All right.
I'll have my audio on, like I'm going to do my thing, kind of walk around, get coffee, so you don't feel like I'm just like staring over your shoulder.
Sure.
And yeah, take your time with it. If you have any questions, you just call me back.
Okay, sounds good.
Cool.
All right, man. I'm back. Did you read any of this yet?
He's back, maybe. I was scanning some of it, but I haven't like sat down and.
Is this not what you wanted?
No. What I'm scanning it's exactly what both of us want.
All right. Tally ho.
Let's do this. Okay. So I'm going to share my screen. Now you just see the Word document.
Yes. See. Yes.
Okay, cool. Okay, sweet. So depending on where you're from or what you've done, we are in the business of making mindset or emotional healing work as simple as possible. And I'm going to use the same process that I use with all my clients, and you're going to see it in real time, and you're going to see how, in one sense, mechanical it is. And yet the mechanical aspect of how to make sense of an emotion is it's the container, it's the structure, it's the form that helps you do the sense making. Okay. So I'm going to repeat myself on purpose so that the listener can start to pick up on the patterns of how you can facilitate something like this. And also so that we can collectively debunk the esoteric vibe around doing mindset work or doing inner healing work. There's a form to it, and it's not like a secret magical thing. Okay, so I'll do as much teaching as is helpful and as little teaching as possible. So there are ultimately 4 behaviors to making sense. Okay. They form an ecosystem. So they're not, it's not a linear mechanical process. It's a organic, nonlinear cycle. The one behavior is noting, which is the most receptive and open, and things are coming in and things are light. We are now leaving noting and entering into what's called clarifying. Noting was feeling. So first, the definition. Noting is recognizing and then collecting resonance or dissonance. So what did that look like? It looked like asking Stephen some questions, Stephen talking out loud. He's describing different feelings. We're following those feelings to specific events, and then we're titling that specific event. At that point, we've done the equivalent of quote unquote noting this emotion, and now we're going to go into clarifying. Clarifying begins with writing the story out in complete sentences. That's step 1 for clarifying. Step 2 is going to be reading the story out loud. So Stephen, when you're ready, go ahead and read Parking Lot out loud.
Okay. Classical music is playing inside the doctor's office. X checks us out of the office. X leads, and I follow behind a little slowly. X seems to be in their head and is distracted. I am in my own world. I walk behind and walk up to the car. It is sunny outside. There are trees surrounding the parking lot, a lot of shades of yellows and green, and many shadows cast by the leaves. I'm a bit distracted by the light and all that is in the lot. I walk around the car to get in. The car backs up. It is a gold Saturn. I'm confused, but not intellectually, because there isn't confusion of reason. I'm unsure of what is happening. The car backs up. I'm slightly concerned of car hitting me. I watch as the car drives down the driveway and eventually out. The car turns left. The sun is shining through the trees on driveway. I'm in parking lot, which is mostly empty, only a couple of cars, including the doctor's black Jaguar with a silver Jaguar on it. I look around. I don't know what to really do. A minute passes. It feels a bit longer. In this time, I feel alone, just myself and the trees. X returns and seems very frazzled. They left me behind. I get in the car.
Cool. What are you feeling as you read the story out loud? What emotions or physical sensations?
Yeah, sadness.
Mhm.
There's something about like an emotion of alone, which maybe is like yeah, I think this is best if I'm just unfiltered. Probably like there's like a emotion of like
Mhm.
loneliness there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Any other emotions? So there's sadness, there's loneliness.
I don't know, maybe wonder, actually. I don't know if wonder is technically like, if it's awe or what that would be, but there's something of that in there as well.
Okay. The sadness, where is the sadness hanging out within the body? What's the texture and location?
I feel like it's the like gravelly stomach feeling.
Okay, what about the degree of it? 1 is low, 10 is high. When you read the story, where is it?
I'd actually say it's maybe like a 5 or 6. Like it feels, when I was trying to access the feeling before,
Yeah.
it was like a speaker on 3 or 4, and now it's like 5 or 6 maybe. Like it feels more pronounced.
Okay.
I can feel it right now more
Okay.
pronounced.
Good. Yep. Does that feeling bring you further back in time to an earlier experience in your life?
There's no immediate connection that's coming up.
Usually when you're dealing with someone's story and they're around, the 4 to 6 age, you're usually down at the bottom in terms of what's accessible. Typically still ask that question though when we're in the feeling, because sometimes there's a story under the story and then we go down into that earlier story. Okay, the loneliness, is that a gravelly feeling in the stomach or is it different?
It feels different. It feels more in like a heart space.
Got it. Okay. In terms of that's where it's felt, what does it feel like in the heart?
Like an ache, like something is maybe being like pressed down on. Okay, like the image that's coming to mind. I had this like security blanket as a kid. It's like this green blanket. It was like my favorite possession. And
Mm-hmm.
it feels like not having that or something. It's like this
Yeah. Or do you
uh
not have it or is it being taken away?
okay. I'm not sure I know. The predominant
Mm-hmm.
sense though is that there's like a feeling of absence.
Okay, cool. That answers it. And that feeling, 1 is low, 10 is high. What is it?
Maybe a 3 or 4. I don't know if it's so much that like the intensity is a 3 or 4, so much as it's like that's the felt intensity. Like that's the
Yes,
awareness
exactly. And that's the
intensity.
question. Yes. Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, I hear the distinction. And the easy part or like the good news is like, yeah, you're not responsible for identifying its quote unquote actual intensity. It's what you're feeling.
Okay.
Cool. The compared to the gravel in the stomach or the absence in the heart, is the wonder feeling, is it feel larger or smaller than those?
Right now,
Correct.
smaller.
Okay, cool. All right. So Stephen mentioned this like ability access to the feeling. The steps that we go through increase access to the feeling. So one thing that creates distance with the feeling is keeping the story in the head. Now we've taken the story out. That gives more access to the story. Reading the story out loud so that you're feeling the vibrations of the words and you're speaking it, that gives more access. Another thing is rate of speech. So it'll be fun and interesting for you to go back and look at the recording of how you read this story the first time. Typically, when someone reads a story that has a lot of emotional charge the first time, they're going faster through it than they normally speak. Their rate of speech picks up. And it's because part of them is unsure or nervous about the thing, right? When you're driving down one of these like overlook areas, like you're on a big road and there's an overlook, a scenic overlook, If you pull off, you see more of what's there than if you drive and, look over as you're driving. So the rate of speech, slowing the story down, is another thing to help, turn up the definition of the feeling and the meaning that's around it. So here is step 2. Step 1 was reading it out loud. Step 2 is to read the story out loud again, but at 70% of your normal rate of speech. So a helpful prompt for this is you say, hey, whatever you just read that first time, we're calling that 100. I want you to come down to 70, whatever that is. And you do your best. You just read it slower than feels normal. And then I'm your partner and I'm going to help you out. If you start to speed up without realizing it, I'll say you can slow down, Stephen. Besides that, everything else is the same.
Okay.
So whenever you're ready, read parking lot from the top at 70% of your normal rate of speech.
Okay. Classical music is playing inside the doctor's office. X checks us out of the office. X leads and I follow behind a little slowly. X seems in their head and is distracted. I am in my own world. I walk behind and walk up to the car. It is sunny outside. There are trees surrounding the parking lot. A lot of shades of yellows and green.
Give yourself a little bit of a break. Slow down slightly, Stephen.
A lot of shades of yellows and green, with many shadows cast by the leaves.
Great.
I'm
pace.
a bit distracted by the light and all that is in the lot. I walk around the car to get in. The car backs up. It is a gold Saturn. I'm confused, but not intellectually, because there isn't confusion of reason. I'm unsure of what is happening. The car backs up. I'm slightly concerned of car hitting me. I watch as the car drives down the driveway and eventually out. The car turns left. The sun is shining through trees on driveway. I'm in the parking lot, which is mostly empty. Only a couple of cars, including the doctor's black Jaguar with a silver Jaguar on it. I look around. I don't know what to really do. A minute passes. It feels like a bit longer. In this time, I feel alone. Just myself and the trees. X returns and seems very frazzled. They left me behind. I get in the car.
Cool. Great job. What changed for you internally when you read the story slowly?
Okay, I'll just tell you what my experience was. I felt like my mind actually was less, not active. It's almost like my mind, I felt like, was being used to help attend to how fast I was driving, like how fast I was putting down the gas pedal. It's like that's what its strength was being used for. It felt like what happened is it created like a spaciousness maybe that actually made a lot of the experience was like more, I felt like a lot more maybe emotionally connected in real time to what was happening, but not even, I don't know. It wasn't like a linear, like I'm following a plot. It was like it was pulling out something, and then the like heat that comes off of it was stronger, right? So like I would say that the feeling I was feeling in my gut went from like a 5 or 6 to probably like a 7 or 8. Probably more like an 8. It even got more focused in certain areas. I also noticed that there were certain points where there was a desire. It almost felt like there was a compulsion to press on the gas a little faster. So I tried to resist that and actually intentionally pause, but like I felt a real tension. Like I felt, I felt a tension there. Yeah, overall really cool though. I like doing things like this and I value like the access this is giving. I'll also say it's like it doesn't feel fun. Like there's a lot of me that actually like doesn't want to do this.
Correct.
Like there was even a part of me, truthfully, there was even a part of me that was like, I don't know, we might be getting close to time here. You know what I mean?
Yep. Yeah, I heard that shift in you.
Yeah.
But at the same time, you like it. I know what you mean. You mentioned the heat turning up or the intensity of the gut feeling going up in certain places. Where in the story were you feeling that?
So there's actually two things I could say there. One is there's specific points in the story that, yeah, it felt like punctuation points or, yeah, those points of wanting to like accelerate. And I don't know if I'll be able to draw out the exact places. I actually think that like towards the end, there was more consolidated. What I mean is like I think there's more emotional intensity like later into the story because I think that might also be like kind of how it plays out. I also was saying though that I actually feel in my body it a bit more intensely, but even more localized. So it's like as the contrast has come up, or like as the brightness has come up on the emotion, it's easier for me to feel the contours. So like now it's actually feels a little bit, I wouldn't say like sharp, but it's a little bit more present in like my lower gut versus like top.
Yep.
Like it's like it's descended a bit. I don't know if it's descended or if it's just it's like as it's being activated, it's showing up in a bit of a different way.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. So this is a helpful question when you have access in that way, which is you're speaking from your gut and from the point of view of Stephen when he's 5 or 6 experiencing this, okay? And the question is, in one sentence, what did this experience mean to you?
There's two things. One is, like if I was going to put it in, if I was going to translate it to English, it would be something like "you are alone." The actual like utterance of the emotion is like yelling out, like ah, like but not like ah. I don't want to like scream into my mic, but it's like it's like the noise that like a woman makes like as she's pushing out a baby or something, right? Like it's pain. It's pain. It's pain.
Is it terror?
Maybe dread.
Okay.
Well, how would you describe terror versus dread?
Dread feels heavier and lower. Terror is sharper and faster and seems to be more from the top down or from the outside in.
That's right. Yeah, it's dread.
Okay, cool. So part of the reason why you feel different towards the end of the story is you start to speak what you're feeling at that part of the story. In this time, I feel alone, right? We don't know what you're feeling until we get to here. In terms of the words, right? Can we add this then in order to include the detail, which is, in this time, I feel alone and what did you say? Dread?
Dread. Yeah, that's fine. The only thing I would, and I really mean this, and I know you understand this, but I think probably a lot of members of like the audience will understand this too, but I just want to name it. I think that probably the intensity of that emotion, like even at the time, was not fully felt. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yes. Yeah, part of why you do this is to allow it to be fully felt. All right. So after we do a slow read, most people, when their internal growth from an emotional level looks like one of restoring their emotional digestion. It's like they're emotionally constipated. And this exercise does a good job of helping with that. So this is like one big, huge steak. And what we're going to do in the third step is cut the steak into pieces so that we can digest it. And the simple way to do that, is to, at every sentence, sometimes there's a little bit of nuance. It's not necessarily always at the end of each sentence, but the rough and dirty way and an easy way for the listener to do is at the end of every sentence, you insert a line break and you put in the word breathe. If you're writing this with pencil and paper, you can just do a big slash mark at the end of each sentence, something that visually stands out so that as you read it, you have that cue. When you get to the word breathe, what you're doing is you're taking a full breath down into your belly. You'll feel your belly button come out. And then you're taking as equally full of an exhale of that oxygen. So fully in, out, and then you're reading the next sentence. All right, so Stephen, I'll stay ahead of you. You'll start at the top. Do you have any questions before we begin?
So same pace, just breathe.
Yeah, you're doing the same slow pace and you're adding the breath. Coolio, so whenever you're ready.
I just want to name something.
Good.
There's a strong feeling in me that I don't want to do this. And I just want to name that for the audience only because I think that's probably what should be expected. Like not what should be expected, but just like this sort of stuff is hard, you know? So
yeah,
that doesn't mean it's not worth it, but it's hard.
Mm-hmm.
Man, it's so funny. It's like I feel like when I was like a kid psyching myself up to jump into a pool. You know what I mean? It's like, I don't know, maybe I'll dip my toe in. All right, here we go. I keep doing it. Okay. Classical music is playing inside the doctor's office. X checks us out of the office. X leads and I follow behind a little slowly.
Do a great job. You've got all the time in the world for your exhale. Take your time with it.
X seems in their head and is distracted. I am in my own world. I walk behind and walk up to the car. It is sunny outside. There are trees surrounding the parking lot. A lot of shades of yellow and green and many shadows cast by the leaves. I'm a bit distracted by the light and all that is in the lot. I walk around the car to get in. The car backs up. It is a gold Saturn. I'm confused, but not intellectually, because there isn't confusion of reason. I'm unsure of what is happening. The car backs up. I'm slightly concerned of car hitting me.
If you feel something coming up, Stephen, you want to let that out.
I watch as the car drives down the driveway and eventually out. The car turns left. The sun is shining through trees on driveway. I am in the parking lot, which is mostly empty, only a couple of cars, including the doctor's black Jaguar with a silver Jaguar on it. I look around. I don't know what to really do. I look around. I don't know what to really do.
Yep. Way to feel that.
Man, I have so much to talk about after this. A minute passes. It feels a bit longer. In this time, I feel alone, just myself and the trees. X returns. I seem and seems very frazzled. They left me behind. I get in the car. I get in the car. I feel dread. Oh,
Come back up. Yep. Come back up to this one.
this meant I was alone. I feel dread when I read this story. Okay.
All right. In no particular order. What are some things you want to share?
First of all, it's super interesting. Like really, really interesting. One thing is when I started reading the story again,
Mm-hmm.
there was a tremendous amount of fear that was coming up originally, like very early in, especially like leading up. Then once I went in, it was almost like my mind was having a hard time processing, or it wasn't processing, because I think that maybe I went from my head to my heart. It seemed like my mind was actually less active, and it really actually felt like there was more space, like to use your language of like cutting into pieces it's like, because they were these little bits, I was like walking around them. They felt almost like lighter and more clear and less convoluted. This is what it is. It felt like rather than being like 15 notes playing all at once, they were played in succession with space around them so I could hear the specific note. The fear wasn't as strong, actually. Like once I actually got into it, the fear wasn't as present. There's a point where I landed on something and I felt like maybe I had hit like the center pole of a tent through which everything else was like kind of coming off of.
Is that when you smiled?
It was when I smiled. It was when I smiled and I started almost like laughing about it. I think that was the same time. It was when we got to, I think it was the thing of like not knowing what to do, because the thing is I actually feel like the urgency that I feel.
Yeah.
When I was describing earlier, like, oh, I feel like I just don't know how to make sense of this, or there's all these different thoughts, or this or that. That's actually like that's the energy behind it, is this feeling of like not knowing what to do, right? And then there was also the part about the alone part. There were a few parts where
I heard you.
It felt like I actually, like me breathing, it wasn't enough breath. Like there either wasn't enough space, or it was just like, it was like a juicier bit or something. Like it was something that took a little bit more. And then the last thing I'll note, so the alone piece was definitely that. That was the thing that felt like, to use the title of the podcast, the most like potent thing. That was the most potent point. And then what was interesting is by the time I got to saying, I feel dread about this, that dread had turned into something else. It wasn't as true.
Yeah, what did it turn into?
This is what I would describe it as. If like I was feeling that dread kind of in the bottom of the gut, it felt like it came up a bit and also dissipated a bit. Like like it became diluted. And I'll tell you one other thing that was interesting is some of those aspects of wonder, or like the beauty that was in this, there was a greater sense of that. Like I used the language of like lightness.
Good.
But it was like some of like the dread actually turned a little bit more into, maybe it's like there was more like acceptance, which was, it became almost like more objective. Like there was less, like when you watch a movie, it could be the exact same action taking place, but like when you have the music and you have like lighting a certain way, it's like the whole tone all of a sudden becomes like a particular thing. It's like it changed the tone. It felt like maybe it changed from, maybe let's use that language of dark, like a dark scene, to like a documentary that actually maybe is like more clinical of sorts. Does this make sense? I'm actually really interested to hear, like, is this how the process normally goes? Like, is it, I just am really interested to hear what you're thinking.
So there's a couple things. One, first, because you're right next to it. So what does it mean to you to feel that shift, to feel the lightness in there? Do you see a different picture, or do you sense a different meaning in the story?
Okay. Yeah. I mean, two things that were coming up like simultaneously. Like one thing towards the end, I was actually feeling, and I don't understand how to put it. It's almost like with an eclipse, right? You have like a dark thing, and then all of a sudden you start seeing this light kind of around it.
That's
There's
a great
certain
way.
amount of like light, and there was actually like a gratitude surrounding all the little bits. Like there was something that actually felt like good. Like there was something there.
Can we pause on that?
Yeah, go for it.
Part of me feels grateful because.
Okay, if I could use like kind of esoteric language, but like this is what's most honest to me.
Yeah.
I feel like I moved beyond the story of the experience to the experience. And at the bottom of the experience of being, whenever I tap into that, like the actual experience of like what this is, of like reality, I experience some level of like beauty and goodness. If I get to like the actual like depth without all like the layers of, well, this means this or this means that, but like just looking at it, just like noticing that this is like actually a thing. It's like the most basic level. It's good.
Why?
I mean, okay, it feels like when you ask that question, it feels like there's like a thread that's connected to a larger tapestry. And I think it, like, the larger tapestry is like this gratitude for like everything. That's like, what I mean by that is that
Mhm.
everything that I've experienced and I do experience, and everything that, I don't know if you've ever seen American Beauty, but there's like this line that goes like, sometimes life is so beautiful I just can't take it, something along those lines. It's like, it's this like touching of, I don't know, like, it's just like really good to be alive. It's like
Mhm.
really good to be like a person. You know, that's like a
Mhm.
really cool thing. It's like a really
Mhm.
cool thing. And specifically this person. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Like, it's a really good thing.
Mhm. Yes. Yes. This makes total sense. I'm following you. Do you see a good that came out of this story, or are you seeing the story as good? It also could be both.
I think like on one level, it's like part of the experience is that it's actually moving away from like there was like less of an energy of trying to qualitatively like
Yes.
experience it as like good or bad. I was just
Yes.
experiencing it as it
Yes.
is. Um,
Got it.
and so I think
Okay.
then the greater
I
context is what I'm recognizing is good.
Yes. Okay. Cool. 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 I'm following you. Let's do one last thing on this. You said this earlier. Can you say that sentence out loud again?
Should I do it slow with the breath around it?
Just, yeah, you can, or you can just say it normally. Either one. That's not delicate.
Maybe there was like acceptance.
Give a full breath in, full exhale out. I'm laughing because you're laughing.
Well, I'm laughing because like there's so
Okay.
much hedging in that. I'm like, maybe there
Right.
was like, you know,
I'm following you. Yeah. So reread again.
maybe there was acceptance.
Full breath in. Once you exhale, you can come back and read again.
There was acceptance.
Full breath in. I know that you can feel this because you caught yourself doing it. Come down at the end when you say it. So instead of there was acceptance, there was acceptance. So less of a question, more of a statement.
There was acceptance.
Good. Full breath in. Reread again.
There is acceptance.
Exhale, and then whenever you're ready, read it again.
I accept this experience.
Give yourself the gift of repping on that 2 more times at your own pace. Big breaths, inhale and exhale in between.
I accept this experience. I accept this experience.
Okay, very cool. There was a funny thing just to talk about it. You have you've got an awesome level of self-awareness. It was when we were at This Meant I Was Alone. We call it up talk. It's when some part of you is uncomfortable with the thing. And so that discomfort is manifested in your intonation coming up at the end of the sentence. And you caught yourself. I was actually about to say it, but you had already restarted the sentence and read it again so that you came down solidly at the end. That was a really cool thing that stood out on my end. Yeah, there's a handful of other things, but yeah, what your experience is typical. This is what making sense is for the emotions. So, okay, so Stephen, we can go two directions. I'll give you my professional opinion. Well, let me actually take a step back. I don't actually know what the rules are. So we were scheduled to go until 1:30. On my end, I can keep going. I don't know what it is for you. Here are the options. One is the full course meal is to do the same exercise for September 11th birthday and mapping Disney World. This would obviously provide the most insight for you. Okay. Another option is to come to mapping Disney World. The reason to do that, if we can only pick one more, is it can be a demonstration of how you can do this style of work for both the heavy and the light stuff. So where are you time-wise and interest-wise and stuff?
Okay. Interest-wise, I'm 10. I'm 10 out of 10. Time-wise, I'm like 1 out of 10. So this is what I'm thinking.
Yeah.
And I wasn't anticipating this, right? I didn't have any expectations. That's why it's so wonderful.
Exactly.
It's just like, I feel like this has been such a cool thing. I guess another thing beyond even the time, and I'm just like naming this for people listening as well, is like, this sort of work is hard. I'm already alluded to this.
Yeah,
but
energy.
Like, It feels like I'm holding my breath and like free diving. Do you know what I mean? Like it feels like I'm having to strain. And so I even feel like from an energy standpoint, it's going to probably putter out. Like even if I had another 3 hours, I know I couldn't go another 3 hours. I could maybe go another like 45 minutes. But then at that point, I think it would like you'd see very depleted return. So this is what I think we should do. I think we should both think about it for a couple of days.
Cool.
And we should set up another time.
Okay, sweet. I'm always down.
What do you think about that?
I'm always down. Yeah, why not? Let's do it.
I think there's a lot to unpack here. And I think I'm even going to unpack a few different things in the meantime. And it does feel like there's something really, really interesting to me about this like whole thing. So
why don't we close by doing some like unpacking of what we've done so far, as a way to, because let's do like 10 minutes of like, if you have the 10 minutes of just doing debrief stuff, and that'll help like transition out.
Sure. I can do 10. Yeah.
So yeah, talk random things like what's going on in your end, thoughts, feelings, whatever. Or questions.
Okay. I'll first go back and just add something to the exercise we were just going through.
Cool.
I noticed that when we kept reframing that acceptance line, the first time I said it, it actually felt like difficult. Like it felt like it came out and it was kind of like forced and I'm trying to like push this thing. But like each time, the declarativeness of it or like the confidence around it, it felt like there was something more material each time. And so it felt less like I was projecting something and more like I was allowing something to be verbalized maybe. I also noticed that there was a feeling of empowerment that came out of it. Not empowerment around like personal agency, but actually a feeling of something disconnected, maybe being connected. Like the image that came to mind, as you can probably tell, like I'm very visual because I just basically talk in metaphor, but it was like it's like if you think of Christmas lights, it was like connecting the two strands, right? Like there's something reconnective, which is, I mean, that's one of those things I also want to sit with because some of the stuff I can see it's like immediate effect, but I almost feel like I need to like walk around and be like, oh, what is this? Like, is this a lamp or like, what is it that I just plugged in?
100%. Yes. Yeah. The reverb coming out of a session like this is a lot. And whenever I do this with somebody, that is explicitly what the next step is, which is find 30 minutes in that same day and just walk. No tech, nothing. And just walk. because you did just move a lot of energy, and the calming motion of walking helps assimilate what happened. Have you and I talked about common sense before?
I don't think so. So maybe just dive into it.
Okay. It's what was coming up when you were saying you felt like things were getting connected. And historically, that's what common sense referred to, which is you had the 5 different physical senses, but how do we as a person experience these things in a unified way rather than, 5 different pieces of film being played at the same time? And the philosophers would call that the common sense. They would describe it as like an ability or a power by which all the different things came together and were synthesized into one common sense or one common experience. So your description maps onto what we're doing, which is we're helping reintegrate your experience of these events, because Stephen's not thoughts and Stephen isn't sight or even feelings. You're all of these things all at once. And, this kind of exercise facilitates that, where you're bringing it all together again.
Like a remembering of sorts.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
Yeah, I don't know if I have any other specific insights right now, other than I'm looking forward to picking things back up, kind of going into chapter 2, or if they'll be our third time talking, so it'll be chapter 3, I suppose. But yeah, I don't think I have anything else. It's actually like there's so much material in me right now.
Right, I get it.
It has to maybe like settle,
Totally. I get it. So here's a closing thought on my end, which is coming full circle. You and I were talking about at the very, very beginning, like the detrimental effect of too much intention or something like that, or grasping or something like that. For the listener who's curious, when Stephen and I went into that story, on my side of that dance, I don't know where we're going. And the process doesn't work if I am attached to a particular direction. That was the word. I wrote attachment earlier from when we were talking, Stephen. It had something to do with what we were talking about. What's really fascinating for me is that this whole thing works when there is an understanding of the mechanics, because there's a form to what we just did. And at the same time, that gets joined and blended, or it gets used in a way that is utterly present. There's no attachment to a particular angle. So for example, when we landed on, I accept this experience, here's what I'm trying to express. Nowhere in this process am I telling Stephen what to think or what to feel. And it's a really important piece. What I'm doing is I'm listening to Stephen, and then based off of knowing what kinds of patterns or things create certain feelings, I'm using that information to then present different things back to Stephen. It happened to land on a fairyland ending. I accept this experience. That's not always how it goes. So seed for thought for part 2 or part 4, whatever we're going to do, is what are those kind of core patterns or mechanics? And also, what happens when we apply the same method to the good stuff? Because in short, what happens is the problem with the bad stuff, when we experience it without integrity, as in we're disintegrated, the problem with the bad stuff is it's too close to home. We're absorbed by the story rather than observing it. And the story has more, it's given more meaning than it actually contained. And so when we make sense, we get distance. You heard Stephen mention that feeling a couple different times, breathing room or space to think. You and the story go like that, and then you're able to consider different meanings other than what you thought it had. And then with the good stuff, the reverse happens. You use the same method, and the quote unquote problem with the good stuff is that it's too far away. It hasn't been, and I mean this literally, taken to heart, and it's given less meaning than it actually had. So, at some later time, we'll see what happens when we use the same method with the lighter kind of stories is that they come closer in and we're able to experience more of the meaning than we thought it contained. So those are my closing thoughts. And also, thanks for doing this, dude. It's really fun. And yeah, I really enjoyed talking with you.
Yeah, this was a super cool thing. And I'm super excited for part 2 or 3 or whatever it's going to be.
Yeah.
All right. Well, Andy, thank you for joining me again.